Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a guy you have definitely heard of, a historical giant who has fascinated people for literal millennia. We're talking about a man who conquered half the known world by the time he was 30, built an empire stretching all the way from Greece to India, and was basically worshipped as a god, Alexander the Great. But here's the thing. Today, we're not just doing the usual breakdown of his military tactics. We're actually going to look under the hood at the emotional and political core of his entire empire. So let's tackle a question you see popping up constantly online right now. Was Alexander the Great gay? Honestly, it's a supernatural thing to wonder, especially when you realize this legendary battle-hardened conqueror was probably head over heels in love with his best friend. But to figure out if history's greatest general actually fits into our modern labels, we've got to do some serious unlearning. We have to completely rewire how we think about love, duty, and relationships, because trying to slap 21st century tags onto a 4th century BCE king, it just doesn't work that way. Section 1. Ancient Greek Cultural Norms. Stepping out of the modern mindset. Okay, so before we can truly understand Alexander, we have to strip away the lens we use today. You know how modern sexuality tends to sort people into these neat little boxes? Gay, straight, bisexual. Well, in ancient Greece, those boxes literally didn't exist. Affection and intense passion happened all the time outside of marriage, sometimes with women, sometimes with men. And here's the kicker. Among the Greek aristocracy, these intense, profound bonds between male companions weren't just tolerated behind closed doors, they were celebrated. They were seen as the absolute highest form of loyalty. You were warriors bound together by love, not just a sense of duty. Now, you might be wondering, where does marriage fit into all of this? Well, in ancient Greece, you didn't marry to find your soulmate. Marriage was a highly calculated tool. It was strictly a political transaction used for forging alliances, popping out heirs, and locking down family honor. If love happened to show up, great, but it was almost never the priority in a royal union, because marriage was essentially just a political job. Deep romantic passion was an entirely separate thing, usually found completely outside of the marriage bed. Section 2. Alexander and Hephaestion, the emotional core. Understanding that specific cultural setup is absolutely crucial if we want to grasp the emotional center of Alexander's universe. And that center was his best friend and constant companion, Hephaestion. These two were raised together in Pella. They were both tutored by the legendary Aristotle. They grew up from boys playing in the dirt to commanders leading massive armies side by side. The ancient writers didn't even bother trying to clarify if they were lovers in our modern sense, because to them, a bond this intense was self-evident and totally normal. Amidst all the chaos and bloodshed of conquering the world, Hephaestion was Alexander's one constant. There is this absolutely incredible story that hits the nail on the head. After Alexander defeats the Persian king Darius, the Persian royal family surrenders. The Persian queen walks in, sees Hephaestion first, who was apparently quite tall and striking, and mistakenly bows to him instead of Alexander. When she realizes what she's done, she is absolutely terrified. But Alexander, he just laughs it off and says, "You weren't wrong. Hephaestion is also Alexander." I mean, wow. In his eyes, they were essentially two halves of the exact same soul. To the Greeks, this kind of closeness wasn't scandalous at all. It was straight up heroic. It instantly reminded them of the great mythical pairing of Achilles and Patroclus. Achilles was the ultimate warrior, and Patroclus was his companion, the guy whose death caused Achilles to literally burn down Troy in his grief. And Alexander worshipped Achilles. He famously slept with a copy of the Iliad right under his pillow, and even made a detour to Troy to pay his respects at his hero's tomb. To Alexander, Hephaestion wasn't just a friend, he was his very own Patroclus. Section 3. Marriage as political strategy. But here's where the two worlds collide. While Alexander's heart firmly belonged to Hephaestion, running an empire requires a completely different playbook. Over the course of his sweeping conquests, Alexander actually took 3 wives. Because, as we talked about earlier, he knew better than anyone that royal marriage in the ancient world was the ultimate tool for power, legitimacy, and keeping your newly conquered territories from rebelling. Let's break down these highly calculated unions. First, he marries Roxana, a Bactrian princess. Now, some sources hint at genuine attraction, but the strategic value was off the charts. It instantly tied him to the local Eastern nobility, proving he was their king, not just some foreign invader. Then, in 324 BCE, he pulls off this incredibly audacious PR stunt, a mass wedding at Susa. In one massive ceremony, Alexander marries 2 Persian princesses at the exact same time,
and then literally orders 80 of his top Macedonian officers to marry Persian noblewomen right alongside him.
This was the ultimate symbolic merging of East and West. And to be clear, these Susa marriages were not about romance or personal intimacy. The ancient historians barely even mention anyone's feelings about it. This was cold, calculated, deliberate policy. By physically binding the Macedonian and Persian elites together, Alexander was attempting to engineer a brand new, unified ruling class. He was using marriage exactly the way ancient Greeks designed it, as a massive world-building tool.
Section 4. Fall of an Empire. The collapse of Alexander's two worlds. So Alexander has this incredibly complex political world glued together by these strategic marriages. But his personal emotional world is entirely anchored by Hephaestion. And the moment he loses that anchor, the whole shebang just rapidly unravels. In 324 BCE, right at the absolute peak of their power, Hephaestion suddenly gets sick and dies. Alexander is completely destroyed. He dives into a grief so dark and destructive, it perfectly mirrors his mythical hero Achilles. He hacks off his hair, bans music across the entire empire, and even executes the poor doctor who couldn't save his friend. It's like something inside him permanently broke. His drive stalled, his drinking spiraled, and then, a mere year later, in 323 BCE, Alexander himself falls ill at a banquet in Babylon and dies. He was only 32 years old. As he's lying there on his deathbed, his top generals are crowding around him in a panic, begging to know who should inherit this unprecedented, sprawling empire. And his legendary reply? To the strongest. With those 3 little words, he provided zero clarity. He essentially threw a grenade into the very legacy he spent his entire life building. Because he never named a clear successor, the empire shatters almost immediately. His generals don't even hesitate. They instantly carve up the map into their own personal kingdoms. Ptolemy grabs Egypt, the Seleucids lock down Persia, and back home, Greece and Macedonia are plunged into decades of bloody civil war. And all those carefully arranged political marriages? They meant absolutely nothing once the chaos started. Tragically, Roxana and Alexander's infant son were imprisoned and quietly murdered by rivals. The grand dream of a permanently united empire died right alongside the man who dreamt it.
When you finally step back and look through that ancient Greek lens, separating the political duty of marriage from the profound personal affection of male companions, Alexander the Great makes so much more sense. He was a visionary whose political empire relied on calculated, loveless unions, but whose actual heart was tethered to one single man. And the second that tether snapped, his world came crashing down. So what do you think? Was his life a flawless, godlike model of absolute greatness, or is it a terrifying warning about the chaotic cost of unchecked ambition? Keep that in mind next time you read about history's most famous conqueror.